The whole town watched Grace Whittaker starve in plain daylight, but only one man looked long enough to feel ashamed. It happened on a blistering afternoon in Mercy Creek, Colorado, in the summer of 1884. The sky was white with heat, the road was soft with dust, and every wagon wheel that passed seemed to grind the town's cruelty deeper into the earth. Grace stood inside Vane's Mercantile, with 13 cents in her open palm. The coins were dull from being handled too much. She had counted them before leaving her cabin, then counted them again beside the water barrel, then once more before stepping through the store door, as if counting could turn 13 into 15. Elias Vane stood behind the counter, neat as a church elder and cold as a locked safe. His silver watch chain hung across his vest. His hair was parted clean. His pale eyes moved from Grace's face to the coins and back again, not with pity, not even with anger. With ownership. "I need bread," Grace said. Her voice was soft, but it did not break. "Whatever this will buy." Vane did not touch the money. "Bread is 15 cents. Then a smaller loaf." "I don't cut loaves." "Then flour." "Flour costs more." Grace looked at the shelves behind him, flour sacks stacked high, coffee tins, beans, salt pork hanging from iron hooks, enough food to fill every table in Mercy Creek twice over. Her stomach twisted so hard she had to press one hand against her dress. Vane leaned forward, resting both hands on the counter. "There is another way to settle your trouble, Mrs. Whittaker." Grace closed her fingers around the coins before he could look at them any longer. "My land is not for sale." "I did not say sale." His smile was small. "I said settlement. A widow alone on a dry claim cannot keep a place like that. Your husband understood business poorly. You should not make the same mistake." At the mention of her husband, something flickered in Grace's eyes. Peter Whittaker had been dead 7 months. 7 months since they brought him down from the Black Pine mine with his shirt covered in dust and his hands still rough with work. 7 months since men took off their hats at the funeral, then went home and forgot her by supper. 7 months since Elias Vane began sending letters about debt, interest, fees, and signatures. Grace had signed nothing. That was why she was hungry. She laid the coins on the counter again, not because she thought Vane would change his mind, but because pride sometimes needs one last witness. 13 cents, she said, for whatever food you can spare. Vane finally touched the coins. He pushed them back toward her with one finger. "Come back with enough." For a moment, Grace stood very still. Outside, a horse shifted against the hitching rail. Somewhere down the street, a hammer rang from the blacksmith shop. A child laughed, then was hushed by his mother. Grace picked up the coins. She did not beg. She did not curse him. She turned and walked out with her back straight, though her hand trembled so badly that one penny slipped from her fingers and rolled near the door. She bent to pick it up. That was when she noticed the boots. A man stood near the feed sacks in the shadowed back corner of the store. Tall, broad-shouldered, weathered by sun and mountain wind. His hat sat low, and a dark beard covered most of his jaw. He held a bundle of traps under one arm, but his gray eyes were fixed on Grace with a stillness that made her feel seen and exposed at the same time. She did not know him. He looked away first, as if he had no right to witness her shame. Grace stepped into the heat and kept walking until the mercantile windows were behind her. Only then did Jonah Mercer move. He had come down from the Elk Ridge Mountains that morning with pelts to trade and no wish to hear town talk. Jonah did not like Mercy Creek. Towns had too many eyes and not enough honesty. Men smiled too often when they meant harm. Women lowered their voices around those men and called it peace. He had seen Elias Vane before. Every mountain man, miner, ranch hand, and widow in 3 counties knew Vane's name. Some called him businessman. Some called him lender. Jonah had other words for men who fattened themselves on other people's desperation, but he kept those words behind his teeth. He waited until Grace was gone. Then he walked to the counter. Vane's smile returned, as if nothing ugly had just happened. "Mercer, you have pelts." Jonah set the bundle down. "I do. I'll give you fair price." "That would be a first." Vane's smile thinned. Jonah did not look at the shelves. He looked at the man behind the counter. "Who was the widow?" Vane tapped one finger on the counter. "A woman with debts." "That was not what I asked." "Grace Whitaker, Peter Whitaker's wife, or widow now." Vane's eyes narrowed a little. "Why?" Jonah picked up his traps. "No reason." But there was a reason. The reason was a woman walking out of a store with 13 cents and no bread, while the man who refused her stood before shelves full of food. The reason was the way she had stayed standing even when hunger tried to fold her. The reason was something old in Jonah's chest, something he had buried under snow and silence years ago, stirring again. He left the mercantile without trading a single pelt. At the far end of town, behind a small bakery with a red clay oven, Jonah found Samuel Pike pulling hot loaves from a board. The baker looked up, flour on his beard. "Didn't expect to see you till fall." "Need bread," Jonah said. "How much?" Jonah placed a coin on the table. "As much as that buys." Samuel stared at the coin. "You feeding a camp?" "No." The baker's face changed, just a little. In Mercy Creek, a man did not ask that way unless he already knew enough. "Grace Whitaker?" Samuel asked quietly. Jonah said nothing. Samuel wrapped 4 loaves in brown paper, then added 2 more. "No charge for the last ones." Jonah looked at him. Samuel shrugged. "Some of us should have done something sooner." Jonah took the bread, then stopped at a second shop on the edge of town where Vane's name did not hang over the door. By the time he was done, he had flour, beans, coffee, dried apples, lard, and a small sack of sugar tied across his saddle. Grace Whitaker's cabin sat beyond town where the road narrowed and the pines began. Jonah found it near sunset, quiet and weather-worn, with a broken fence line and a little garden struggling in the dust. Smoke did not rise from the chimney. He tied his horse in the trees and carried the food to the porch. He did not knock. He placed the bread by the door, set the flour beside it, then arranged the rest carefully, not like charity dumped in haste, but like a promise left by hands that meant no insult. Then the door opened. Grace stood there holding a small iron poker in both hands. Her face was pale from hunger. Her dark hair was pinned badly, as if she had done it without a mirror. There was dust on the hem of her dress and sorrow around her eyes, but her chin was lifted. "You," she said. Jonah removed his hat. "Ma'am, what are you doing on my porch?" "Leaving." Her eyes moved from him to the food. Her mouth tightened. "I did not ask for help." "No. I do not take gifts from strange men." "I am not asking you to." "That is exactly what this is." Jonah looked toward the fading road, then back at her. "No, Mrs. Whitaker. A gift asks you to feel grateful. This is just food." Her grip on the poker loosened, but only a little. "Why?" Jonah thought of Vane's finger pushing those coins back. He thought of Grace bending to pick up that fallen penny like it was the last piece of herself she could not afford to lose. Because 13 cents should not be the difference between a person eating and going hungry. Grace stared at him for a long moment. The wind moved through the pines. A loose shutter tapped once against the cabin wall. Somewhere behind the trees, Jonah's horse snorted softly. Grace looked down at the bread. Her eyes shone, but she did not cry. "What is your name?" she asked. "Jonah Mercer." She repeated it softly, as if she was not sure whether to remember it or fear it. Jonah stepped back from the porch. "Good evening, Mrs. Whittaker." He turned toward the trees. Behind him, Grace's voice came quiet. "Mr. Mercer." He stopped. "Did you see what happened in the store?" Jonah did not turn around right away. "Yes," he said. The silence after that answer carried more than either of them knew how to say. Grace stood in the doorway with food at her feet and a cold iron poker in her hand, watching a mountain man disappear into the pine shadows. She did not know yet that Elias Vane wanted more than her debt paid. She did not know Peter's death had left behind a secret buried under her land. And she surely did not know that the stranger who filled her pantry had just made himself the most dangerous enemy in Mercy Creek. Grace did not bring the food inside right away. For a long time she stood on the porch and stared at it as if it might vanish if she moved too quickly. The bread sat wrapped in brown paper. The flour sack leaned against the door frame. Beans, coffee, lard, dried apples, and sugar rested in a careful row, each thing placed with quiet respect. Not thrown down. Not left like scraps. Placed. That was what unsettled her most. Grace had known pity since Peter died. She had seen it in women's faces at church and in men's awkward nods on the street. Pity lowered its eyes. Pity spoke softly and then went home to a warm supper. Pity did not fill a pantry. But this was not pity. She was not sure what it was. She carried everything inside, one thing at a time. Her arms trembled under the weight of the flour, and the shame of that weakness burned hotter than the summer air. Before Peter's death she had been strong. She could haul water, mend fence, split kindling, and knead bread without stopping. Now her body felt like a house with the beams eaten hollow. Still, when she set the bread on the table, she did not eat at once. She locked the door first. Then she pulled the curtain across the front window. Only after that did she sit, unwrap one loaf and break off a piece. The bread was still soft in the middle. The first bite nearly broke her. Grace shut her eyes and pressed one hand over her mouth, not because the bread was so good, though it was, but because hunger had made her careful even with feeling. A person could live too long on almost nothing and forget that being fed was not a luxury. It was dignity. Outside, dusk settled over the pines. The little cabin creaked softly as the heat left the boards. Peter's chair sat empty beside the cold stove. His coat still hung on the peg by the door because Grace had never found the strength to move it. She looked at it while she ate. "I do not know what to do," she whispered. The coat, of course, did not answer. The next morning, Grace rose before sunup with more strength than she had felt in weeks. She made coffee, thin but real. She mixed flour and lard into biscuits, then stopped herself from using too much. Hunger had taught her to measure hope by the spoonful. After breakfast, she went to Peter's desk. It was a plain pine desk he had built the first winter after they married. One drawer stuck in damp weather. One leg was shorter than the others, so it leaned unless a folded scrap of leather was placed under the foot. Grace had cursed that desk many times when Peter was alive. Now she touched it like it was something holy. Inside were papers she had read too often and understood too little. Loan notes, claim records, receipts from the Black Pine Mine, letters from Elias Vane written in polished words that always seemed to circle back to the same demand. Sign the land over. Grace spread the papers across the desk and read until the morning light turned sharp. Peter had borrowed money, yes, more than she liked, more than he had admitted, but the debt still did not explain Vane's hunger for the claim. The land was rocky and stubborn. Their cabin was small. The mine had barely paid enough before the collapse. So why did Vane want it so badly? Grace found part of the answer folded inside an old ledger. It was not a letter, not exactly, just a page torn from Peter's work notes, written in his heavy hand. East Ridge sample showed bright trace. Need second test. Do not tell Vane yet. Grace read the words 3 times. Bright trace. Peter had used that phrase before, late at night when he thought she was asleep. He had sat at the table turning a small stone between his fingers, rubbing dirt away with his thumb. When she asked what it was, he smiled and said, "Maybe trouble, maybe blessing. Hard to tell the difference at first." That had been 2 weeks before he died. Grace folded the paper and held it against her chest. A knock struck the door. Not loud, not friendly either. Her hand went cold. She slipped Peter's note into her apron pocket, picked up the iron poker from beside the stove, and crossed the room without making the floorboards speak. When she opened the door, Deputy Amos Rusk stood on the porch with his hat in one hand and discomfort on his face. Behind him in the yard, Elias Vane's clerk waited on horseback. Grace looked from one man to the other. "Morning, Mrs. Whittaker," the deputy said. "Deputy." "Mr. Vane sent word." "I can see that." The deputy cleared his throat. He was a large man, but he did not fill his badge well. Grace had once seen him carry a sick child through mud to the doctor's office, so she knew he had kindness in him. That made his weakness harder to forgive. "He wants a formal answer by Friday," Rusk said, "on the settlement." "My answer has not changed." The clerk shifted in his saddle. "Mr. Vane says you may want to reconsider, seeing as how certain people have been interfering." Grace kept her face still. "What people?" The clerk smiled a little. "Mountain people, men who do not understand legal business." Grace's fingers tightened around the poker. Deputy Rusk glanced at the clerk, then back at her. "Best not to make trouble, ma'am." "I did not make this trouble," Grace said. "It came to my door wearing a clean vest." The deputy looked down. The clerk's smile disappeared. "You have until Friday," he said. "After that, Mr. Vane will proceed." "With what?" "With what the law allows." Grace stepped forward just enough that both men noticed. "Then tell Mr. Vane to bring the law, not threats dressed up as papers." For a moment, no one moved. Then the deputy put his hat back on and turned away. The clerk followed, but not before letting his gaze move over the porch, the window, the door, the woodpile, as if he was counting how a person might enter when no one invited him. Grace watched them ride off. Only when they were gone did she close the door and lean against it. Her heart was beating hard, but beneath the fear something else had started to rise. Anger. By noon, Jonah Mercer was back in Mercy Creek. He did not go to Vane's Mercantile. He went first to Samuel Pike's bakery, where the old baker was kneading dough with both sleeves rolled to the elbow. "Vane sent his clerk to the widow this morning," Samuel said before Jonah asked. Jonah's eyes darkened. "Word travels fast." "In this town, fear travels faster." Jonah leaned against the table. "What does Vane want with her land?" Samuel stopped kneading. "That is the question that gets a man in trouble." "I am already in trouble." The baker studied him for a long moment, then wiped flour from his hands. "Peter Whittaker found something up on that ridge before he died," Samuel said quietly. "Not enough for public talk, but enough that Vane started smiling at him like a wolf near a lamb pen." "Silver?" Maybe more than silver. Peter brought a stone to Alden Briggs, the Asher. 2 days later, Vane offered to buy the claim. Peter refused. 3 weeks after that, the mine shaft came down. Jonah said nothing, but his face changed. Samuel saw it and lowered his voice. "Careful, Mercer, folks have wondered. Wondering is one thing, saying it is another." Jonah turned toward the door. Where is Alden Briggs? Gone. Dead. No, worse for Vane. Drunk somewhere with a guilty conscience, last I heard. Jonah stopped. Samuel pointed toward the north road. He keeps a room above the old freight barn when he is in town, but if you go looking, do it quiet. Jonah nodded once and stepped into the white glare of Main Street. Across town, Elias Vane stood at the upstairs window of his mercantile, watching him cross the road. His face held no smile now. Behind him, the clerk waited. That mountain man is asking questions, the clerk said. Vane's fingers rested on his watch chain. Then let us make sure he gets answers that lead him nowhere. And the widow. Vane looked toward the distant pines, where Grace Whittaker's cabin sat hidden beyond the road. She has until Friday, he said, unless she makes me shorten the week. Jonah found Alden Briggs above the old freight barn, exactly where Samuel Pike said he might be. The room smelled of stale whiskey, cold ash, and old fear. A cracked window looked down on the freight yard, where weeds grew between wagon tracks and two broken wheels leaned against a wall like tired men. Alden Briggs sat at a small table with his coat still on, though the room was hot enough to make the air feel heavy. He was younger than Jonah expected, maybe 40, maybe less, but his face had the worn look of a man who had been running from himself longer than from anyone else. When Jonah stepped through the open door, Alden reached for a bottle. Jonah took it before his fingers closed around it. Alden looked up. If Vane sent you, tell him I already said I would keep quiet. Vane did not send me. Then get out. Jonah set the bottle on the far side of the room. I came about Peter Whittaker. Alden's face went still. Outside, a mule brayed in the yard below. Somewhere on Main Street, a wagon rolled past, the sound dull under the heat. Alden looked toward the window as if judging whether he could climb through it. Jonah did not move. You tested a stone for him, Jonah said. Alden swallowed. I tested many stones. Not like this one. The Assyr rubbed both hands over his face. His fingers shook. You do not know what you are asking. I know enough. No, Alden said, his voice rising. You know what men like you always know. Tracks, weather, how to sleep under snow. But you do not know what it is to have Elias Vane look at you across a desk and tell you every debt your brother owes, every mistake your father made, every place he can ruin you without lifting his voice. Jonah watched him closely. So he threatened you. Alden gave a bitter laugh. Threatened? No. Vane does not threaten at first. He offers help. Then he shows you the rope already around your neck. What did Peter bring you? Alden's eyes moved to the door. Silver-bearing rock. Rich. Richer than anything Black Pine had shown in years. It came from the east ridge of his claim. I told Peter he needed a second test and a proper filing before word spread. But word spread. Alden looked down. You told Vane. I owed him money. Jonah's jaw tightened. Alden looked up sharply. Do not stand there like you never made a wrong choice because you were afraid. Jonah said nothing. That silence seemed to hurt Alden more than any accusation. The Assyr leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Vane came to me 2 nights later, asked if Peter knew what he had. I said maybe. Vane asked if Peter had filed. I said not yet. His voice dropped. After that, Peter stopped coming around. Did Vane send a man into the east shaft? Alden's face drained. Jonah took 1 step closer. Alden. I heard talk, Alden whispered. Just talk. From who? Alden looked toward the floorboards. A man named Silas Greer worked for Vane when Vane needed dirty work done without getting dust on his own cuffs. Greer was in town the week before the collapse. He had rock dust on his boots, dark pine clay from the Black Pine ground. I knew because Assiers noticed dirt. Where is Greer now? Gone south, maybe Santa Fe, maybe dead. Men like that do not stay where questions grow. Jonah studied him. Do you have proof of the test? Alden did not answer. Jonah waited. At last, Alden stood, crossed to the wall, and pried loose a narrow board behind the stove. From inside, he pulled a folded paper and a small cloth packet. He laid them on the table with the care of a man placing his sins before God. The record, he said, my original test note, Peter's name, date, sample marks, and that is a piece of the stone he brought. Jonah looked at the paper but did not touch it. Why keep it? Alden's eyes shone with shame. Because I am a coward, not a fool. I knew one day the truth might need a witness. Jonah took the paper and stone. Then be one. Alden stared at him. If this goes before a judge, you will speak. I cannot. You can. Vane will ruin me. He already has, Jonah said quietly. You are just sitting in the room he left you. The words landed hard. Alden turned away, but Jonah saw his shoulders shake once, not with crying exactly, with something older, something trapped finally finding air. When Jonah left the freight barn, he tucked the test record inside his coat and kept to the alley behind the livery. He felt eyes on him before he saw the man. A rider sat under the shade of the feed shed, pretending to fix a saddle strap. Jonah knew a watcher when he saw one. He crossed the yard without looking directly at him and went toward the bakery. Samuel Pike was pulling trays from the oven when Jonah entered through the back door. Samuel took one look at his face. You found something. More than something. Jonah placed the folded paper on the table. Samuel read it slowly. The baker's flour-covered fingers stopped moving. His mouth pressed thin. Lord help her, he said. Where is Grace? Cabin, unless Vane's men have scared her into town. They went to her already. Samuel looked up. Jonah put the stone back into his coat. I need to get this to her before Vane moves again. At that same hour, Grace was not at her cabin. She had ridden to the cemetery. Peter's grave sat on a low hill beyond Mercy Creek, where the grass grew thin and the wind kept little kindnesses moving. Someone had placed a wildflower on a child's grave nearby. Grace had brought nothing. She hated that. But flowers cost money, and hunger had made even love practical. She knelt beside Peter's wooden marker and brushed dust from his name. I found your note, she said softly. I think you were trying to tell me something, and I was too tired to hear it. The wind moved across the hill. Grace pressed one hand to the earth. I am scared, she admitted, but I am done being quiet. She stayed there until the heat began to rise from the ground. Then she stood and saw a rider at the cemetery gate. Not Jonah. Elias Vane. He sat on a fine black horse with his hat low and his gloves clean. He looked out of place among the crooked markers, like a banker had wandered into a churchyard and found no profit there. Grace did not move toward him. Vane dismounted and walked through the graves with slow, careful steps. A widow should not spend too much time with the dead, he said. It clouds judgment. Grace looked at Peter's marker. Some men spend too little time thinking about them. Vane's face tightened, then smoothed again. I hear you have been asking questions. I hear you have been sending men to my door. That is because you keep mistaking stubbornness for strength. Grace turned to him fully. Her hand was at her side. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. No, I spent 7 months mistaking silence for survival. I will not make that mistake again. Vane stepped closer. Careful, Mrs. Whitaker. A woman alone can lose more than land. Her stomach clenched, but she did not step back. If this moment makes you believe Grace should keep standing, Stay with the story, because the truth buried under Peter's grave is only beginning to rise. Grace lifted her chin. You are wrong about one thing, Mr. Vane. His eyes narrowed. And what is that? I am not alone anymore. Behind Vane, a horse came hard up the cemetery road. Jonah Mercer rode through the dust, one hand on the reins, his coat pulled tight over the paper that could change everything. Vane turned just enough to see him. For the first time since Grace had known him, Elias Vane looked surprised. Then the surprise vanished, and what replaced it was far colder. Mr. Mercer, Vane said, you are becoming a problem. Jonah stopped beside the gate and looked from Vane to Grace. No, he said, I think I found the problem. And with that, Elias Vane's hand moved slowly toward the inside pocket of his coat. Jonah saw the movement before Grace understood it. His hand did not go for a weapon. He only stepped forward, slow and firm, putting himself between Grace and Elias Vane with the kind of calm that made danger feel ashamed of making noise. Vane's fingers paused inside his coat. Grace held her breath. For one thin moment, the cemetery seemed to forget the wind. Even the dry grass around Peter's grave stopped whispering. Vane looked at Jonah, then at Grace, and something hard worked behind his eyes. When his hand came out, it held a folded paper. Not a pistol. Not a knife. A paper. Somehow that frightened Grace more. I came to offer mercy, Vane said. His voice was smooth again, but the smoothness had a crack in it now, since you seem determined to involve strangers in family business. Grace's face stiffened. There is no family business between us. There is debt. There is greed. Vane's mouth tightened. Jonah stood near the cemetery gate, one hand resting on his saddle horn. His horse tossed its head, restless in the heat, but Jonah did not move. The paper inside his coat felt heavy against his chest. Alden Briggs's test note. The small stone, proof that Peter had found rich silver before he died. Vane lifted the folded paper. This is a final settlement, more generous than you deserve. Signed today, and you keep enough money to leave Mercy Creek with dignity. Grace looked at the paper, then at Peter's grave. Leave. That was what Vane wanted. Not payment, not fairness. He wanted her gone from the land, gone from the town, gone from the memory of what Peter had known. No, she said. Vane smiled without warmth. You have not even read it. I have read enough of your papers. This one could save you. Grace stepped away from Peter's marker. Dust clung to the hem of her dress. Her hands were empty, but she looked stronger than she had in weeks. You do not want to save me, Mr. Vane. You want to bury the last person asking questions. Vane's gaze flashed to Jonah. Is that what this mountain man has filled your head with? Jonah spoke for the first time. She had questions before I came down from the ridge. Vane turned fully toward him, and you think yourself fit to answer them? No. Jonah reached into his coat and took out the folded test record. I think Alden Briggs is. The name struck Vane like a stone against glass. His expression did not shatter, but a thin line appeared in it. Grace saw it. What is that? She asked softly. Jonah did not hand it to her yet, not with Vane watching, not with the cemetery open and lonely around them. A record, he said. Peter had a sample tested before he died. Grace's lips parted. Vane laughed once, quiet and sharp. A drunk assier's scribble will not change a legal debt. Maybe not, Jonah said, but it will make a judge ask why you wanted this land so badly before the mine collapsed. The air changed. Grace felt it. The dry hillside, the crooked markers, Peter's grave, Vane's black horse shifting at the gate. Everything seemed to lean toward that one word. Collapsed. Vane folded his settlement paper slowly. "You are stepping into matters you do not understand." Jonah's eyes did not leave him. "I understand men who hide behind papers. And I understand men with no family, no roots, and no standing in town." Vane's voice lowered. "Men who can disappear without leaving much trouble behind." Grace felt cold despite the sun. Jonah only looked at him. "That a threat?" Vane smiled again. "A warning. Mountain trails are dangerous, Mr. Mercer. So are witnesses." For the first time, Vane said nothing. Grace looked from one man to the other. She understood then that Jonah had not only brought food to her porch. He had walked into a fight that had been waiting long before she knew its name. He had found something Vane feared. And fear made powerful men careless. Vane stepped back and slipped the settlement paper into his coat. "You have until Friday," he said to Grace. "After that, the choice will no longer be yours." "It never was with you," Grace said. "That is why I am done listening." Vane's face hardened. He turned, mounted his horse, and rode out of the cemetery without another word. Dust rose behind him, drifting over the gate and into the road like smoke from a fire not yet seen. Grace waited until he was gone before her knees weakened. Jonah moved toward her, but stopped before touching her. He seemed to know she would not want to be caught like someone helpless. "What did you find?" she asked. He handed her the folded paper. Grace opened it with trembling fingers. The writing was not Peter's. It was Alden Briggs's, slanted and stained but clear enough. "Peter Whitaker, East Ridge sample, high-grade silver trace, strong vein possibility, urgent second filing recommended." Grace read the words once. Then again. Her breath caught somewhere low in her chest. "He knew," she whispered. "Peter knew." "Yes." And Vane knew because Alden told him. "Yes." Grace folded the paper carefully. Her hands were shaking now, but not from weakness, from the awful shape of truth beginning to stand upright. "Peter died 3 weeks after this." Jonah's silence answered more clearly than words. Grace turned toward the grave. For months she had spoken to Peter as if grief were the only thing left between them. Now grief had a new companion. "Suspicion." "What do we do?" she asked. Jonah glanced toward the road. "We get this copied. We keep the original hidden. Then we find someone with enough authority to stop Vane before Friday." "Who?" "Judge Holly's rides circuit through these parts. He is due in Dry Bend in 2 days. If we reach him first, he can freeze any transfer of your claim until the papers are reviewed." Grace looked toward the south road. Dry Bend is a full day's ride. "Hard ride," Jonah said. "Then we ride hard." He studied her face. "You have not eaten enough for that." Grace looked down at the paper in her hand. "I have eaten more in the last 2 days than I did in the 2 weeks before you came." "That does not make you strong." "No," she said, "but Peter's name on this paper does." Jonah did not argue. They rode back toward her cabin by the Ridge Road, avoiding Main Street. The sun slid lower, burning the sky copper over the pines. Grace kept the paper tucked inside her dress, close to her heart. With every hoofbeat, she felt the weight of what they carried. Not just proof. A beginning. When they reached the cabin, the yard was too quiet. Jonah noticed first. He raised one hand, and Grace stopped her mare before the fence. The front door stood open. Grace's breath caught. "I locked it," she said. Jonah dismounted without a word. He moved toward the cabin with careful steps, reading the ground, the porch, the broken dust near the doorway. Grace followed despite the fear climbing her throat. Inside, Peter's desk had been pulled open. Papers lay scattered across the floor. The mattress had been cut. The loose floorboard near the stove had been pried up. Someone had searched everything. Grace stood in the doorway, looking at the room that had already held too much sorrow, now torn apart by a man's fear. Then Jonah bent beside the desk and picked up a scrap of paper that had been left in the middle of the floor. 4 words were written on it. "Last chance, Mrs. Whittaker." Grace looked at the note. Jonah looked at the open window. And from outside, somewhere beyond the pines, a horse gave a sharp cry. The horse cried again from the trees. It was not a long sound, just one sharp cry, cut short in a way that made Grace's blood turn cold. Jonah was already moving before she could speak. He crossed the room, took his rifle from beside the door, and stepped onto the porch with his body low and his eyes searching the pines. Grace followed him with Peter's old revolver in both hands. "Stay behind me," Jonah said. "No." He glanced back once, saw her face, and did not waste time arguing. They moved toward the tree line together. The evening light was thin now, caught in the pine branches and broken across the ground. Dust lay disturbed near the fence. Jonah crouched and touched one print, then another. His face hardened. "2 men," he said, "maybe 3. They came from the East Wash." Grace looked toward the darkening trees. "Are they still here?" Jonah listened. The world seemed too quiet. No bird call, no wagon sound from town. Only the faint creak of the open cabin door behind them and the soft breath of Grace's mare near the fence. Then Jonah stepped around a pine and stopped. Grace came beside him and felt her heart drop. Jonah's horse stood tied badly to a low branch, wild-eyed and trembling. A cut rope dangled from the saddle horn. The saddlebag had been opened and thrown to the ground. Nothing valuable had been taken because there had been nothing valuable there. It had not been theft. It had been warning. Pinned to the saddle with a small knife was another paper. Jonah pulled the knife free and unfolded the note. "Leave Mercy Creek before sunrise." Grace read it over his arm. The handwriting was not Vane's. It was rougher, but she felt his voice in every word. She looked at Jonah's horse, then at Jonah. "This is because of me." "No," he said. "You would not be part of this if I had not opened that door." Jonah turned to her, and for the first time his calm cracked enough for her to see the feeling underneath. "I was part of it the moment I watched him push those coins back at you." Grace had no answer for that. The pines moved in the evening wind. A few needles fell between them. The world smelled of dust, horse sweat, and coming night. Jonah pulled the knife from the paper and slipped it into his belt. "We cannot stay here." Grace looked back at the cabin. The door hung open. Her papers were scattered inside. Peter's desk had been violated. The bed had been cut open. Even the small blue cup Peter used every morning had been knocked off the shelf and broken on the floor. It was not much of a home anymore, but it was hers. "They want me frightened enough to sign," she said. "Yes." "Then I will not give them frightened." "Grace." She looked at him. His voice softened. "Bravery is not staying where men can come for you in the dark." Her anger wanted to rise against that, but his eyes stopped it. There was no command in them, no ownership, only concern and the hard honesty of a man who knew what night could do. She looked back at the cabin. Then she nodded. They worked quickly. Grace packed the papers that still mattered, Peter's note from the desk, the test record Jonah had brought, the small stone wrapped in cloth, and what money she had left. Jonah gathered food from the pantry he had filled and put it into a flour sack. He moved through the cabin carefully, not touching more than he had to, as if even in the ruin he understood it was still her home. When Grace reached for Peter's coat on the wall peg, her hand stopped. She had not moved it in 7 months. Jonah saw her pause. You can bring it, he said. Grace swallowed. It still smells like him sometimes. Jonah looked away, giving her the kindness of not watching her grief too closely. She took the coat down, folded it, and placed it over her arm. By the time they stepped back outside, the first stars had appeared above the ridge. "Where do we go?" she asked. "Samuel Pike's Bakery for tonight. At dawn, Dry Bend." "That road will be watched." "Yes." "Then we cannot take it." Jonah looked at her. "There is another trail through Miller's Pass. Harder, less used, it comes out south of Dry Bend." "Can we make it?" "If we start before dawn." Grace looked toward the town lights in the distance. "Then we go to Samuel." They rode without lanterns. Mercy Creek looked peaceful from far away, a few windows glowing, smoke lifting from chimneys, the church bell still against the fading sky. But Grace knew better now. A town could look peaceful while fear sat behind every door. Samuel opened the bakery's back entrance before Jonah knocked twice. His eyes moved from Grace's pale face to the flour sack, then to Peter's coat over her arm. "They came to the cabin," he said. Grace nodded. The old baker stepped aside. "Kitchen's warm, come in." Inside, the bakery smelled of bread and ashes. It was the safest smell Grace had known in months. Samuel gave them coffee and stew from a black pot. Grace ate slowly, though hunger urged her to hurry. Jonah sat across from her, one hand around his mug, his eyes on the back door more often than on his food. Samuel listened as Jonah told him about Alden Briggs, the test record, the stone, the destroyed cabin, and the warning tied to the horse. When Jonah finished, Samuel sat down heavily. "Vane is scared," the baker said. Grace looked at the papers on the table. "Good." Samuel's mouth tightened. "Scared men with money do foolish things and call them necessary." Jonah nodded. "We leave before first light." "For Dry Bend." "To reach Judge Holly's." Samuel thought for a moment, then stood and went to a cupboard. He pulled out a small tin box and opened it. Inside were coins, folded bills, and a silver button. Grace shook her head before he spoke. "No." Samuel gave her a stern look. "Do not make pride do hunger's work." "I cannot take your savings." "You are not taking them. I am putting them where I should have put them when Peter died." The room went still. Samuel's face changed, and for the first time Grace saw shame in the old man's eyes. "I knew Vane was pressing you," he said quietly. "I knew you were selling things. I knew you were eating less. I told myself a woman like Grace Whitaker would ask if she needed help." His voice broke just a little. "That was a coward's comfort." Grace's eyes filled, but she held the tears back. Samuel pushed the tin toward her. "Let an old man stop being a coward. If you believe silence can wound as deeply as cruelty, stay with this story, because Mercy Creek is about to learn what happens when one woman finally refuses to suffer quietly." Grace slowly took the tin. "Thank you," she whispered. Samuel nodded and looked away fast. Later, after Samuel had gone to prepare blankets in the storeroom, Grace stood near the bakery window. Outside, Main Street was dark. Vane's Mercantile sat at the center of it, closed and still, but Grace could almost feel him awake inside it, planning. Jonah came to stand a few steps behind her. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you." He gave the smallest breath that might have been a laugh on a kinder day. Grace turned. "Why did you never marry?" The question surprised them both. Jonah looked down at his hands. "I was meant to once." Grace waited. "Her name was Clara, my sister's friend. We were young. I thought I had time." His jaw tightened. "A winter storm took my sister's family. Clara was with them. I was trapping 2 ridges over. By the time I reached them, there was nothing left to do but remember every choice I had made before it happened." Grace's anger softened into something quiet. "I am sorry." Jonah nodded once. "Since then, I kept to the mountains. Easier to lose weather than people." Grace looked at him for a long moment. "And yet here you are." His eyes met hers. "Yes," he said, "here I am." Neither of them moved. Then a sound came from outside. Not a wagon, not a horse. A slow knock on the bakery's front door. 3 times. Samuel's voice came from the back room, low and alarmed. "No one knocks like that at this hour." Jonah reached for his rifle. Grace slipped Peter's note and Alden's record into her dress pocket, close to her heart. The knock came again. And this time, a voice called through the door. "Mrs. Whitaker, Mr. Vane says the week has been shortened." The words outside the bakery settled into the room like cold ash. "Mr. Vane says the week has been shortened." Grace did not move. Her hand stayed pressed over the papers hidden inside her dress pocket. She could feel the stiff edge of Alden Briggs's record and Peter's note against her palm, as if the dead and the afraid were both asking her not to let go. Jonah stood between her and the front room, rifle held low. Samuel came from the storeroom with a rolling pin in one hand. It would have looked foolish on any other night, but nothing about his face was foolish now. "Back door," Jonah said quietly. Grace shook her head. "If we run every time Vane knocks, he will own every door in this town. This is not the time to make a stand." "When is?" Jonah looked at her, and she saw the answer he did not say. "When there are witnesses, when daylight comes, when Judge Hollis can hear you." Samuel stepped close to the hall that led to the front shop. "Who is there?" he called. A voice answered, rough and impatient, "Open up, Pike." Grace recognized it. Clay Dobbins, one of Vane's paid men. He had the kind of voice that sounded used even when he spoke softly. Samuel looked at Jonah. Jonah nodded once. The baker unlocked the front door but did not open it wide. He kept one shoulder against the frame. Clay Dobbins stood outside with 2 men behind him and Deputy Amos Rusk beside them, looking like he wished the road had swallowed him before he reached the bakery. Dobbins held a folded paper in his hand. "Mrs. Whitaker inside?" he asked. "This is a bakery," Samuel said. "People come inside for bread, not widows." Dobbins smiled without humor. "Then she can come out for the paper." Grace stepped into the doorway before Jonah could stop her. "I am here." Deputy Rusk's eyes lowered for half a second. Shame, Grace thought. Not enough to help, but enough to show he knew better. Dobbins handed the paper forward. "Notice of immediate property action. Mr. Vane says you have refused fair settlement and put the claim in danger of abandonment." "Abandonment," Grace said. The word struck her harder than she expected. Her cabin had been broken into, her bed cut open, her pantry searched, her husband's desk scattered across the floor, and now Vane had found a word that made his cruelty sound official. Deputy Rusk cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitaker, the claim is being reviewed for failure to maintain residence and debt compliance." "I was in my cabin today," Grace said. "Your men know that, they tore it apart." Dobbins lifted both hands, careful with accusations. Jonah stepped into view. Dobbins' smile vanished. "You were told to leave town," he said. Jonah looked at the paper in Dobbins' hand. "And yet here I am." The 2 men behind Dobbins shifted. Jonah did not raise his rifle. He did not need to. His stillness did more work than any threat. Grace took 1 step forward. "Deputy Rusk," she said, loud enough that Samuel could hear, and anyone near the dark street might hear too. "Are you officially serving this notice?" Rusk swallowed. "I am present while it is delivered." "That is not what I asked." His face reddened. Mr. Vane requested that I witness delivery. Then witness this, Grace said. She took the paper, tore it once down the middle, and let both halves fall to the bakery floor. I will not sign, I will not leave, and I will not call a robbed home abandoned because Elias Vane paid men to frighten me out of it. Dobbin stepped forward. Jonah moved first. Not fast, not wild, just one step, enough to place himself in the narrow doorway beside Grace. Dobbin stopped. For a few seconds, the only sound was the low burn of the bakery oven and a horse blowing in the street. Deputy Rusk looked at the torn paper, then at Grace. "Mrs. Whitaker, this path you're taking is dangerous." Grace's voice was quiet, so was hunger. The deputy flinched as if she had struck him. Dobbin spat to the side. "Vane will hear about this." "Good," Grace said. "Tell him I want him too." The men left, but not quickly. They backed away like dogs unwilling to turn from a fire. Deputy Rusk went last. At the bottom step, he stopped and looked over his shoulder. "Do not be here at dawn," he said, so low only Grace and Jonah heard it. Then he walked into the dark. Samuel shut the door and bolted it. For a long moment, no one spoke. Jonah turned to Grace. "Now we leave." She nodded. This time she did not argue. They moved through the bakery like people inside a storm cellar listening to the wind tear at the roof. Samuel packed bread, dried meat, and a small tin of coffee. Grace folded Peter's coat tight and tied it behind her saddle. Jonah checked both horses and led them through the backyard, away from Main Street. Samuel walked with them to the alley. "Take Miller's Pass," he whispered, "but do not use the old bridge. It rotted through last spring." Jonah nodded. "We cross at Widow Creek." Grace looked back at the bakery. Samuel reached out and squeezed her shoulder. His hand was flour-dry and warm. "Peter would be proud," he said. Grace's throat tightened. "I hope so." "He would," Samuel said, "and he would tell you to ride before that mountain man has to carry you there." A small breath of almost laughter left Grace. It surprised her. It surprised Jonah too, though he tried not to show it. They rode out through the back lane, keeping close to the dark line of buildings until Mercy Creek fell behind them. The moon was thin and high. The road toward Miller's Pass lay pale in front of them, then vanished into pine shadow. For the first hour neither spoke. Grace focused on the mare beneath her, the horse's steady breathing, the leather creak of the saddle, Jonah's shape ahead of her dark against the lighter dust. Each sound felt too loud. At Widow Creek, they stopped to water the horses. Grace slid down and nearly lost her balance. Jonah was there before she fell, one hand near her elbow but not gripping it. "I am all right," she said. "I know. You always say that. Because you usually are." She looked at him then. In the cold moonlight his face seemed carved from worry and patience. The bruise near his jaw had darkened. Dust clung to his beard. He looked tired, though she doubted he would ever admit it. "Jonah," she said. "He waited. If we reach Judge Holly's and he does nothing." Jonah looked toward the dark water, moving over stone. "Then we find another way." "You make that sound simple." "It is not." "Then why say it like that?" He turned back to her. "Because you have had 7 months of people telling you every door is closed. I will not be another one." Grace lowered her eyes. For a moment the night felt less empty. Then Jonah's horse lifted its head. His ears pricked forward. Jonah went still. Grace followed his gaze to the ridge above the creek. 3 lanterns moved between the trees. Not town lanterns. Rider lanterns. Jonah took the reins and stepped close to Grace. "They found the pass," he whispered. Grace's hand went to the hidden papers. From the ridge, a voice called into the dark. Mercer, Mrs. Whittaker, no need to make this harder than it already is. Jonah looked at Grace. Then he looked toward the black line of Widow Creek, where the water ran narrow but fast over unseen stones. "We cross now," he said. Grace stared at the dark water. Behind them, the lanterns began moving down the ridge. Widow Creek looked narrow from the bank. That was the lie of it. In the moonlight, it seemed like a dark ribbon sliding between stones, no wider than a wagon road. But when Grace stepped closer, she heard the deep pull under the surface. The water was not high, but it was fast, and the rocks beneath were slick with moss and shadow. Behind them, the lanterns came lower through the trees. Jonah took Grace's mare by the bridle and looked into her eyes. "Keep your feet loose in the stirrups," he said. "If she slips, let go of the saddle and grab mane, not leather." Grace swallowed. That sounds like advice from a man who expects her to slip. It is advice from a man who respects water. The first rider shouted again from the ridge. "Mercer, do not be foolish. Vane only wants the papers." Jonah's mouth hardened. "He wants more than papers," Grace said. "Yes." He led his horse into the creek first. The animal stepped carefully, feeling for stone under the dark water. The current struck his legs and broke white around his knees. Jonah walked beside him, one hand on the saddle, the other holding the reins. Grace followed. The mare hesitated at the edge. "Come on, girl," Grace whispered, "just a little farther." The mare stepped in. Cold water climbed over Grace's boots, then higher. Her skirt dragged heavy against her legs. The current pushed at the mare's side, and Grace gripped the saddle horn before remembering Jonah's warning. She loosened her hand and caught a fistful of mane instead. Halfway across, a shot cracked through the trees. Not close enough to hit. Close enough to frighten. The mare jerked hard. Her back feet slid. Grace gasped as the horse lurched sideways into deeper water. Jonah turned at once, but the current was between them now, silver and black under the moon. "Grace!" "I have her," she shouted, though she was not sure she did. The mare fought for footing. Water splashed over Grace's knees. One stirrup slipped from under her boot. She leaned forward, pressing herself close to the horse's neck. "Easy," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Easy, please." Another shot rang out, this one into the air above the creek. Jonah raised his rifle and fired once toward the ridge. Not to strike a man, to make them remember he could. The lanterns scattered. The mare found stone. With a hard leap, she climbed the far bank, nearly throwing Grace from the saddle. Jonah caught the bridle as soon as she reached him, and Grace slid down more than dismounted, landing in wet grass with both hands still locked around the reins. For a second, she could not breathe. Jonah was beside her. "Are you hurt?" Grace shook her head, but her hands went at once to her dress pocket. The papers were still there. Peter's note. Alden's test record. The small stone wrapped in cloth. She closed her eyes. "Still safe," she said. Jonah looked back across the creek. The riders had reached the other bank but had stopped. None of them wanted to cross in the dark under Jonah's rifle. "Move," he said. "They will find another crossing." They rode into the trees without lanterns. The trail beyond Widow Creek was worse than the one before it. It climbed through black pine, then cut across a slope where loose rocks shifted under the horse's hooves. Grace's wet skirt clung cold to her legs. Her fingers ached from holding the reins. Every breath hurt, not from sickness but from fear held too long in the chest. Still, she did not ask to stop. Jonah noticed. Of course he did. At the top of the ridge, he pulled them into a hollow between two boulders and motioned for silence. They waited there while the night listened back. Far below, a rider cursed. Another horse stumbled. Then the sounds faded east. Jonah leaned close enough that Grace could hear him, without his voice carrying. "They are taking the lower road. If we keep above them, we can reach Dry Bend first." Grace nodded. Then she saw the dark stain on his sleeve. "You're armed." Jonah looked down, as if surprised to find blood there. "It is nothing." That is what men say when it is not nothing. He almost smiled but did not. Grace tore a strip from the lining of Peter's coat before Jonah could stop her. "Grace." He would not mind. That silenced him. She wrapped the cloth around his upper arm where a splintered piece of bark or stone from the shot had cut him. The wound was shallow, but it had bled enough. Her hands were cold and clumsy, yet she tied the knot firm. Jonah watched her face while she worked. When she finished, he said, "Thank you." Grace looked at the strip of Peter's coat tied around Jonah's arm. The sight should have hurt. Instead, it steadied her. They rode again. Near dawn, the sky behind the mountains turned the color of old pewter. The trees thinned, and a wide valley opened below them. At the far edge sat Dry Bend, small and dusty, with a white church, a courthouse, and smoke rising from cook stoves. Grace had never been so glad to see a poor little town in her life. But Jonah stopped before the trail descended. His body went still. Grace followed his gaze. On the road below, 2 wagons stood outside the courthouse. Horses were tied along the rail. Men moved in front of the building, not ranchers or travelers, but men in town coats. Too many men for dawn. Grace's stomach tightened. "Is that Judge Holly's?" she asked. Jonah did not answer at once. A man stepped out of the courthouse then, narrow and clean, with a leather case in one hand. Grace knew him before Jonah spoke. "Vane's lawyer," Jonah said. "How did he get here first?" "Main road is faster if no one is chasing you through creek water." Grace stared down at Dry Bend. The papers against her heart suddenly felt smaller than they had all night. Then the courthouse door opened again. Alden Briggs stepped out between 2 men. His hands were not tied, but his head was lowered, and even from the ridge Grace could see the shame in the way he walked. Jonah's jaw tightened. They found Alden. Grace felt the morning wind cut through her wet dress. Below, Elias Vane's lawyer turned toward the courthouse steps and lifted a document for the waiting men to see. Jonah looked at Grace. "We are not too late," he said. But his voice told her what his words would not. They were closer to too late than either of them wanted to admit. Grace looked down at Dry Bend and felt the night's hard ride settle into her bones. Her dress was still damp from Widow Creek. Her hands were cold around the reins. Dust clung to her face, and her hair had slipped loose under her hat. Beside her, Jonah sat straight in the saddle, but she could see the blood-dark cloth tied around his arm where a strip of Peter's coat held the wound closed. Below them, Alden Briggs stood outside the courthouse with his head bowed between 2 men. Vane's lawyer lifted a paper toward the open courthouse door, as if truth were something that could be carried in a leather case by whoever arrived first. Grace's fingers pressed against the hidden records. "What if Alden has already signed something?" she asked. Jonah watched the courthouse. "Then we make him speak in front of the judge." "What if he will not?" Jonah looked at her. "Then you will." Grace turned toward him. The answer was simple, too simple, but something in it reached through her fear. For 7 months men had spoken over her, around her, about her land, her debt, her husband, her future. She had waited for someone else to find the right words. Maybe Jonah was right. Maybe the words had to be hers. They rode down into Dry Bend as the sun rose over the courthouse roof. A few people stopped to stare at them. A wet widow on a tired mare. A mountain man with a blood-stained sleeve. 2 horses breathing hard from a night trail no sensible person would take. Grace did not care how she looked. She only cared that she arrived. At the courthouse steps, one of the men beside Alden saw them first. His eyes widened. He touched the lawyer's arm. The lawyer turned. He was narrow-faced, sharp-dressed, and too clean for a man standing in road dust before breakfast. Grace knew at once he belonged to Vane, not because she had seen him before, but because he had that same careful look, the look of a man who believed paper could make cruelty respectable. "Mrs. Whittaker," he said, surprised but quick to hide it, "you have made quite a journey." Grace climbed down from the mare. Her legs nearly failed her, but she caught the saddle and stayed upright. "I had reason. My name is Franklin Mercer." Jonah's eyebrow lifted slightly. "Unfortunate name." The lawyer's mouth tightened. "No relation, I assure you." Grace stepped past him toward Alden. The Asher would not meet her eyes. "Alden," she said. His face twisted. "I am sorry." The words were barely sound. The courthouse door opened. A gray-haired man in a black coat stood inside, holding a cup of coffee. His eyes moved over the scene with the tired sharpness of a man who had spent his life hearing people lie in better clothes than they deserved. "I am Judge Hollies," he said, "and if everyone is finished blocking my steps, perhaps someone can explain why 3 separate petitions concerning the same property landed on my desk before sunrise." Franklin Mercer smiled at once. "Your Honor, my client Elias Vane has filed an emergency debt attachment and abandonment petition against the Whittaker claim in Mercy Creek. We also have sworn concern that certain mineral records now being waved about are unreliable." Grace's heart struck hard. Judge Hollies looked at Alden. "Mr. Briggs, are those concerns yours?" Alden opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Franklin Mercer put a hand on his shoulder. "Mr. Briggs has admitted that the original sample notes were incomplete and may have been misunderstood." Jonah stepped forward. "Take your hand off him." The lawyer drew back, offended. "This man has no standing here." Judge Hollies looked at Jonah. "And who is this man?" "Jonah Mercer," Jonah said. "Witness." "To what?" "To men chasing a widow through the hills for papers they claim do not matter." The judge's eyes narrowed. Grace reached into her dress pocket and pulled out the folded record, Peter's note, and the small cloth-wrapped stone. Her hands shook, but her voice did not. "Your Honor, my husband found a rich sample on our East Ridge before he died. Alden Briggs tested it. Elias Vane learned of it, then pushed to take our land. My husband also wrote that Vane sent a man to inspect the east shaft before it collapsed." Franklin Mercer cut in. "Wild suspicion from a grieving woman cannot hold against signed debt instruments." Grace turned on him. "No, but grief taught me to read every paper your kind puts in front of a widow." The porch went quiet. Judge Hollies' mouth twitched, not quite a smile. He held out his hand. "Let me see the documents." Grace placed them in his palm. The judge read slowly. Nobody moved. A fly buzzed near the railing. Jonah's horse stamped once. Alden Briggs's breathing sounded uneven, like a man standing too close to the edge of something. Judge Hollies looked up. "Mr. Briggs." Alden flinched. "Did you write this sample record?" Alden looked at the lawyer. Then at Grace. Grace did not plead with him. She did not beg. She only stood there in her wet dress with Peter's coat tied behind her saddle and the truth of 7 months carved into her tired face. Alden's eyes filled. "Yes," he said. Franklin Mercer stiffened. Judge Hollies leaned forward. "Speak clearly." "Yes, Your Honor, I wrote it. Peter Whittaker brought me that stone. It was rich. I told Elias Vane because I owed him money and because I was afraid." The lawyer snapped, "Mr. Briggs, remember your written statement." Alden looked at him with sudden anger. "I remember the man who made me write it." The words hit the courthouse steps like a dropped hammer. Grace felt the breath leave her. Alden turned toward the judge. "Vane's men found me before dawn. They told me to sign that the record was uncertain. It was not uncertain. Peter had silver under that claim, and Vane knew it before Peter died." Judge Hollis lowered the papers. For a moment, even the morning seemed to hold still. "If you have stayed with Grace this far, tell me honestly in the comments, would you have had the courage to stand there and speak when everyone powerful wanted you silent?" Judge Hollis turned to Franklin Mercer. "Your emergency petition is denied for now." "Your Honors." "I said for now." The judge's voice hardened. "I am placing a temporary hold on any transfer, seizure, attachment, sale, or debt enforcement against the Whitaker claim until a full hearing is held in Mercy Creek." Grace shut her eyes for 1 second. "Not victory, but breath." The judge pointed at Alden. "You will remain available to the court." Alden nodded quickly. He looked at Grace. "Mrs. Whitaker, I am sorry." Grace wanted to hate him. Part of her did. But she saw a broken man who had finally chosen one brave thing after too many cowardly ones. "Then keep telling the truth," she said. Before anyone could answer, a boy on a lathered horse came hard down the street, shouting before he reached the courthouse. "Judge Hollis, message from Mercy Creek." Everyone turned. The boy slid from the saddle, nearly falling, and thrust a folded note toward the judge. Hollis read it. His face changed. Jonah stepped closer. "What happened?" The judge looked at Grace first, and that frightened her more than if he had looked away. "Elias Vane went to your cabin at dawn," he said, "with Sheriff Cole and 6 men." Grace's hand flew to her throat. The judge's voice lowered. "They claim they found forged papers inside and have arrested Samuel Pike for hiding evidence." Grace did not remember stepping backward. One moment she stood on the courthouse steps with Judge Hollis's temporary hold still warm in the morning air. The next, Jonah's hand was near her arm, not holding her, only close enough in case her knees gave way. "Samuel Pike arrested." Her cabin searched again. Forged papers found inside. For a few seconds, all Grace could hear was the creak from the night before, dark water rushing over stone. Then her mind cleared. "No," she said. Judge Hollis looked at her carefully. Grace lifted her head. Samuel did not hide anything. He would not. Franklin Mercer closed his leather case with a sharp click. "You cannot know what a man would do when pressed, Mrs. Whitaker." Jonah turned his head just enough to look at him. The lawyer went quiet. Judge Hollis folded the message and put it inside his coat. "Mr. Mercer, you will remain here until I decide whether your own papers deserve closer attention." The lawyer's face tightened. "Your Honor, I represent a client in good standing." "You represent a client whose name has appeared too often this morning." The judge turned to the boy who had brought the message. "Who sent this?" "Sheriff Cole, sir." "Did he send any official copy of these so-called forged papers?" "No, sir. Just said Mrs. Whitaker was to return and answer questions." Grace laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "Answer questions in Mercy Creek, where Vane owns the store, the sheriff's ear, and half the debt in town." Judge Hollis studied her with new respect. "Mrs. Whitaker, I am returning with you." Grace blinked. The judge looked toward the street. "If your cabin has been used to plant evidence, I want to see who put their hands on it. If Samuel Pike has been arrested for hiding records, I want to hear what records. And if Sheriff Cole has mistaken himself for the law instead of its servant, I will correct him before supper." Alden Briggs stepped forward then, pale but standing. "I am coming too." Franklin Mercer snapped, "You are not going anywhere." Alden looked at him, and something tired but firm came into his face. "I have spent too many years being told where fear wants me to stand." Grace looked at him. Alden lowered his voice. "If Vane is building a lie, he may use my name again. I want to be there when he tries." Judge Hollis nodded, "Then saddle up." They left Dry Bend within the hour. The judge rode at the front with the boy who had carried the message. Jonah rode beside Grace. Alden followed on a borrowed mule, gripping the reins like a man who trusted papers more than animals. The sun climbed high, and the road shimmered white ahead of them. Grace should have been exhausted. Her body ached from the night ride. Her wet dress had dried stiff around her knees. Hunger and fear had hollowed her out, then filled her with a hard light she did not recognize. But she did not slow. Every mile back to Mercy Creek felt like walking toward a fire where someone she loved had been trapped. Samuel had given her bread when pride could no longer feed her. He had opened his back door. He had taken shame into his own hands and tried to turn it into courage. Now Vane had reached for him, because he could not reach her fast enough. Jonah must have seen the thought move across her face. "Samuel knows how to hold steady," he said. Grace looked at the road. "Good men should not have to hold steady in jail because of me." "Not because of you." "Because of Vane, yes, I know," she swallowed. "But knowing that does not make the guilt lighter." Jonah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When my sister died, I blamed Weather first. Then the men who did not go when they could have gone. Then myself, because blame is always looking for a warm place to sleep." Grace turned to him. His eyes stayed on the road ahead. "It took me years to understand that carrying guilt for another man's wrong does not honor the dead. It only lets the wrong man walk lighter." Grace held those words in silence. The wind moved over the open land. Far ahead, Mercy Creek was still hidden beyond the next rise, but she could almost feel it waiting. "I loved Peter," she said quietly, "but sometimes I am angry with him." Jonah did not look shocked. That was another small mercy. "He signed papers he did not explain," she said. "He borrowed money and smiled like hope could pay interest. He kept secrets about the ridge because he wanted to surprise me with good news. Then he died and left me inside all of it." Her voice shook, but she did not stop. "And I hate myself for being angry at a dead man." Jonah looked at her then. "You can love someone and still tell the truth about what they left behind." Grace's eyes burned. She looked away before tears could fall, not because she was ashamed, but because she needed to see the road. By late afternoon, they reached the ridge above Mercy Creek. The town lay below in dusty gold light, the church steeple, the livery, Vane's Mercantile at the center like a dark nail driven into clean wood. The bakery stood across the street, its front door open, no smoke rising from the oven. Grace's chest tightened. They rode down together. People came out when they saw Judge Hollis. Curtains moved, doors opened. Men paused with buckets in their hands. Women stood at fence lines. Word traveled through Mercy Creek faster than a bell. Vane stood in front of the sheriff's office. He had expected Grace. He had not expected Judge Hollis. For the first time, Grace saw irritation break through his polished face. Sheriff Cole stood beside him, a heavy man with a badge and a jaw set too hard. Deputy Rusk hovered near the steps, looking sick with worry. "Your Honor," Sheriff Cole said, "we were not told you were coming." Judge Hollis climbed down from his horse. "That was the first pleasant part of my day." Vane stepped forward. "Judge, this matter concerns forged evidence and interference with a lawful debt action." Grace looked past him to the small jail window. Samuel Pike stood behind the bars. His face was bruised near one cheek, but when he saw Grace, he lifted his hand. Something inside her steadied. Judge Holly saw the bruise too. "Who struck the baker?" he asked. Sheriff Cole shifted. He resisted. Samuel called from inside. "I asked why Elias Vane's men were in my bakery before sunrise." The street went quiet. Vane did not turn around. Judge Holly's voice cooled. "Open the cell." "Your Honor, he is being held pending." "Open it." Sheriff Cole hesitated one heartbeat too long. Jonah took one step forward. The sheriff unlocked the door. Samuel came out slowly, stiff but upright. Grace moved to him at once. "I am sorry," she whispered. Samuel shook his head. "None of that." Judge Holly's faced the sheriff. "Show me the forged papers." Vane nodded to Deputy Rusk, who brought a folder from inside the office. His hands trembled when he gave it to the judge. Judge Holly's opened it. Grace watched his eyes move over the first page. Then the second. Then he stopped. "What is it?" Grace asked. The judge did not answer right away. He lifted one page and held it toward the lowering sun. Jonah leaned close. Alden Briggs made a small choking sound. Grace looked at him. "Alden." The Asir pointed at the bottom of the page. "That mark," he said, "that is not Peter's hand, and it is not mine." Vane's face remained still, but one muscle moved in his cheek. Alden stepped closer, suddenly certain. "I have seen that ink stamp before." Judge Holly's looked at him. "Where?" Alden's voice carried across the whole street. "In Elias Vane's private ledger room." Every face turned toward Vane. For one moment, no one breathed. Then Jonah looked across the street at the locked upstairs window of Vane's Mercantile, where the curtains moved though no wind touched them. And Grace understood. The truth was not in her ruined cabin. It was across the street, behind Vane's own door. The whole street turned toward Vane's Mercantile. For years, that building had stood at the center of Mercy Creek like a judge no one elected. Men entered it needing seed, rope, flour, credit, medicine, and mercy. Too many came out owing more than they could ever repay. Now the upstairs curtain moved again. Judge Holly's closed the folder in his hand. "Mr. Vane," he said, "open your ledger room." Vane's face stayed smooth, but Grace saw the change in his eyes. Not fear exactly. Fear was too honest. This was calculation running out of road. "You have no warrant." "I have a sworn statement from Alden Briggs, suspicious papers bearing a mark tied to your private office, a widow's property under court hold, and a sheriff who would be wise to remember who gave him that badge." Judge Holly's looked at Sheriff Cole. "Open the building." The sheriff swallowed. For one breath, he looked at Vane as if waiting for permission. Then Deputy Amos Rusk stepped forward. "I have a key," he said. The street went still. Vane turned slowly. "Deputy." Rusk would not meet his eyes. "I carried papers for you. I stood quiet too long. I know where the ledgers are kept." Grace watched the deputy's hands shake as he crossed the street. Jonah moved beside her, shoulder close but not touching, steady as a fence post in a storm. Rusk unlocked the Mercantile. The door opened with a tired wooden groan. Judge Holly's entered first. Jonah went with him. Alden Briggs followed. Grace stepped inside last, and the smell of the store struck her at once. Tobacco, leather, coffee, flour. Bread she had not been allowed to buy. Her eyes went to the counter, where 13 cents had once lain like shame in her open palm. She walked past it. Upstairs, the ledger room was smaller than Grace expected. One desk, 2 locked cabinets, a shelf of bound books. Elias Vane had built his power in a room barely larger than a pantry. Rusk opened the first cabinet. Inside were ledgers wrapped in oilcloth, each marked by year. Judge Hollis opened one, then another. Alden leaned close, face pale. "There," Alden said. His finger stopped on a line. "Payment to S. Greer, East Inspection, Black Pine, Confidential." Grace gripped the back of a chair. Jonah's jaw tightened. Judge Hollis turned the page. Another entry. Whitaker sample confirmed. Action before filing. The room seemed to tilt under Grace's feet. Peter had not been foolish. He had not only stumbled into debt and left her behind in ruin. He had found something. He had tried to wait until he could protect it, and Vane had moved before him. Judge Hollis read on, his face growing harder with every line. There were names, dates, changed debts, false fees added after funerals, claims taken from widows, minors, and ranch hands, records of payments to men who had scared families from their homes. Not every truth was written plainly, but enough of them were written by Vane's own hand. Outside, voices rose as word spread. Grace took Peter's note from her pocket and laid it beside the ledger. East Wall looked wrong after. Judge Hollis looked at the note, then the ledger, then at Grace. "This will go before federal court," he said, "and it will not go quietly." Vane stood in the doorway now, flanked by Sheriff Cole and 2 court men who had ridden with the judge. He stared at the open ledgers as if betrayal had come from paper, not from his own hand. "You cannot prove what happened in that shaft," he said. Grace turned to him. "No," she said, "maybe not all of it. Maybe the law will take longer than my heart wants. But you knew what Peter found. You lied. You forged papers. You starved me toward a signature. And now this whole town knows why." Vane's mouth opened, but no clean answer came. That was his first real confession. Silence. Judge Hollis nodded to Sheriff Cole. "Elias Vane is to be held on charges of land fraud, forged instruments, unlawful debt manipulation, and witness intimidation pending federal review." Sheriff Cole looked like a man watching his own life crack open, but he obeyed. Vane did not shout. He did not beg. Men like him did not know how. He only looked once at Grace, cold and empty. She held his gaze until he looked away. And in that moment, something inside her stood up fully. Not healed, not whole, but free. By sunset, the ledgers were carried to the courthouse under Judge Hollis's seal. Samuel Pike was cleared before the whole street. Alden Briggs gave his sworn statement. Deputy Rusk surrendered his badge until the judge could decide whether a weak man could ever again be trusted with strong authority. Mercy Creek did not become good in a single day. No town does. But doors opened that evening. Women brought food to the bakery. Men who had once lowered their eyes came to give names, dates, receipts, stories. Widow Hart brought an old claim paper folded in a Bible. A miner named Boone left 3 letters tied with string. One by one, silence found a voice. Grace went home the next morning. Jonah rode with her. The cabin was still broken. The desk drawers hung open. The mattress was ruined. The blue cup Peter had loved lay in pieces on the floor. Grace knelt and picked up the largest piece. For the first time, she cried without trying to stop herself. Jonah stood at the door and let her have the room. When the tears passed, she wiped her face, stood, and opened the pantry. Inside were the last of the flour, beans, and coffee Jonah had brought. Grace looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at him. "You filled my pantry before you knew my story," she said. "I knew enough." "What did you know?" Jonah stepped into the cabin, hat in his hands. "I knew no one should have to ask permission to survive." Grace looked down at the broken cup in her palm. Months later, when the first snow touched Mercy Creek, the Whitaker claim was still hers. The federal case was not finished, but Vane's store had a new owner and its credit books were open to any judge who asked. Peter's name had been spoken in court with honor. That mattered to Grace more than she expected. Her pantry stayed full now, but not because a man rescued her once. It stayed full because she planted, traded, baked, and accepted help without calling it shame. And Jonah Mercer did not return to the high ridge for winter. He built a new fence around Grace's garden. He fixed the porch step that had creaked since Peter's time. He came for coffee in the mornings and stayed longer each week, speaking little, listening much, never asking for a place in her life like a debt owed. One evening, Grace found him stacking wood beside the cabin while sunset turned the pines gold. "You said mountain men lose where they're easier than people," she said. Jonah set another log on the pile. "I did. Are you still afraid of losing people?" He looked at her, and the quiet between them was honest. "Yes." Grace stepped closer. "So am I." The wind moved through the pines. A lantern glowed in the cabin window. Inside, bread cooled on the table, warm and whole. Grace held out her hand. Jonah looked at it, then took it gently, as if he knew a wounded heart was not something to grab, but something to be trusted with. If this story touched your heart, remember Grace when life feels too heavy. Sometimes one act of kindness does not just fill a pantry, it gives a person the strength to stand again. That winter, Mercy Creek remembered the widow who would not sign away her home. And Grace remembered the day she had only 13 cents for bread, because that was the day a quiet mountain man saw her hunger, saw her pain, and helped her find her voice. The last image folks carried of them was simple. A cabin at the edge of the pines. Smoke rising into a cold blue sky. A full pantry. 2 horses by the fence. And Grace Whittaker standing in the doorway beside Jonah Mercer, no longer waiting for mercy from town, because she had learned how to build a life from truth, courage, and one warm loaf of bread.